All right, friends, ladies and gentlemen, let's kick the event off. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you had a chance to grab a bite. My name is Bilal Wahab. I'm the Wagner Fellow here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm joined by three distinguished Iraq and Middle East experts. To my immediate left is Ken Pollack, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on Middle Eastern political military affairs, focusing in particular on Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Gulf countries. Dr. Pollack served twice at the National Security Council, first as Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs, and then as Director for Persian Gulf Affairs. To his left is Dr. Nussaibah Younis, who is currently an Associate Fellow in the Middle East Program at the Chatham House, which is a London-based think tank. She's an expert on the economy, politics, and foreign policy of Iraq. She also serves as a senior advisor to the European Institute of Peace, where she advises on high-level mediation efforts in Iraq. She has previously served on the Iraq Task Force, which was led by Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Joining us remotely is my colleague here at the Institute, Mike Knights, who is a senior fellow and specializes in the military and security affairs of Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and the Gulf states. Mike has traveled widely in Iraq, Yemen, and the Gulf states and regularly briefs U.S. government policymakers, congressional committees, and U.S. military officers on regional security affairs. He has worked quite extensively and traveled to the region and worked with local military and security agencies on the ground in Iraq, the Gulf states, and Yemen. He's probably one of the best experts on the nitty-gritties of the Iraqi security and military. Sometimes I use doctor, sometimes I didn't. Actually, everyone is a doctor, so let's just go on first-name basis. The agenda for today is as follows. I'll offer some brief introductions, and then we'll segue to Ken, who will tell us about the new government, which he has written about, the new government in Iraq. Then I'll ask my colleague Mike from Boston to talk about the relationship between the Iraqi government and the Kurdistan Regional Government. And then I'll ask Nussaibah to zoom out a little bit and maybe highlight how these developments in Iraq and Kurdistan are seen regionally and internationally, the view from particularly Iran, the Gulf countries, and Turkey. But by way of introduction, we all recently have been to Iraq. Actually, Mike, Ken, and I overlapped. Nussaibah got back last week. I went to monitor the KRG elections, and I also spent some time in Baghdad meeting some of the members of the new team. Iraq is going, we keep saying Iraq is at a crossroads, but it has been at crossroads forever now. But maybe this is one of those times that there's probably more substance to making that comment. Because there are opportunities in Iraq, especially as the rest of the region gets more volatile and the news about them move and shift in a different direction. For example, we saw something that you don't see in the region. We saw peaceful transfer of power. You saw a president walk into a building, a palace, and a president walk out. We saw a prime minister walk in and a prime minister walk out. And actually, we also saw 14 ministers walk into buildings and 14 others walking out without a single bullet being shot. So that in itself is a feat, worth clapping for. Other opportunities include a more responsive Iraqi polity, as I'm sure we will get into, to the street, to the demands of the public, and to the grievances and anger of the population that came to the streets and demanded better services, as you saw in the Basra protests. By way of listing opportunities, we also have obviously the defeat of ISIS, which in fact was not a main issue in the elections, neither in Kurdistan nor in Baghdad. The elections were mainly about governance, about services. Iran and the United States have tacit approval to the new government and the new team, so that in itself is also good news. And then we also have a greater level of engagement from the Sunni community and the Kurdish community. For Kurdistan, this is particularly interesting because there were doubts that after last year's independence referendum, the Kurds might boycott Iraqi politics, but actually the Kurds, probably more than others, are fighting over positions in Baghdad. So that is also probably a piece of good news there. But of course, this is still Iraq, and we haven't had major structural changes aside from the defeat of the ISIS caliphate. So the challenges are still there. We still have an ISIS that is evolving from a caliphate into an insurgency. By estimates by DOD, ISIS today is where ISIS was before the invasion of Iraq in 2014. Or probably it is what it was at the height of al-Qaeda power. So the challenge is still there. It's smaller compared to what it was 2 years ago, but the challenge and the danger isn't gone. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the presence of ISIS challenge also creates the raison d'etre for Shia militias to continue to play an oversized role in Iraqi politics and Iraqi security. As I mentioned earlier, the main challenge is the challenge of governance. People in Basra protested against all of the political parties. They burned down all of the political party offices, the militia offices, and the government offices. They were quite indiscriminatory in terms of who they attacked. And that was a sheer anger in a city that accounts for 75% of Iraq's oil wealth, and yet they don't have potable water, they don't have enough electricity in the scorching summer heats. So that was not this is an area that doesn't have ISIS problems. This is an area where sectarianism is not an issue. This was the Shia population of the south completely disappointed in their Shia-led government, and therefore they burnt, as we say in Kurdish and Arabic, the green and the yellow together, meaning the fresh and the frail. And then finally, we have two other challenges. We have the economy that remains in the grips, in the clasp of the government. The constitution and the government keep swearing by free markets, and yet every time they pass legislation and regulation, they go back to the old habits of state control and probably the Ba'ath regime's DNA that still runs in the government bureaucracy. The Ba'ath DNA being one of socialism. And then finally, maybe I should mention this first for this audience, Iran, which is a geographic fixture that continues to be effective and exercise influence, especially as Iraq's politics is personal and transactional. So how do we square off these challenges and opportunities when we look at an effective team which has been elected into government to lead the next 4 years? The institutions remain weak. Grand Ayatollah Sistani plays an important role, but where will Iraq be in 4 years? If the institutions remain this weak, and perhaps Grand Ayatollah Sistani is no longer around to be the arbiter that puts all of the ducks in order. So again, challenges, opportunities, but we're here to not only tell you about what we read, but high-level conversations that my colleagues have had with Iraqi officials, but also meetings with CSO and NGO activists, with young students, with entrepreneurs and business people. So this is not the kind of event in which you parachute into a city, you meet with the usual crowd and come back. Actually, myself and my colleagues had the opportunity to meet with other segments and sectors of the society, which I think is very important for these kind of fresh perspectives on the ground to be representative. Now, without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Pollack, Ken Pollack, to share his remarks and maybe agree or disagree with my challenges and opportunities about the new Iraqi government. Ken, thank you.
Thank you, Bilal. It's great to be here. It's great to be here with this group of colleagues. And yes, you set me up perfectly. Bilal set me the task of kind of summarizing the situation of the new government in 7 to 10 minutes. And you actually helped a lot by laying down some of that groundwork. I'll also start, when we're talking about Iraq, it's like on most things, you can talk about politics, you always start with a quote by Churchill. When we're talking about Iraq, we always start with a quote from Ryan Crocker. And there was a point that you made, Bilal, that I thought was perfect, something that Ryan had once said, which is that since the invasion, every single year, Americans have been saying, American experts on Iraq have been saying, this is the critical year in Iraq. And every year they were right. Okay? And this, again, is the critical year in Iraq. Now, I actually think that there's more evidence that this truly is a critical year, and let me unpack that. First, the May elections were a disaster. We all know about that. We can talk more about, why that was the case and what exactly happened. They were a disaster. We wound up getting a government, or at least a leadership, that was far, far better than I think any of us anticipated, frankly, than we deserved coming out of that election, right? Adel Abdul Mahdi, Barham, a number of the people that they have around them, these are people who would genuinely like to see change in Iraq. They are people who would like to see change in Iraq in the direction that I think most of the folks in this room, certainly those of us on this panel, believe is the right direction for Iraq, what is necessary for Iraq. That's very important. Right? That does or should give us hope that there really is something here that we can build on, that there's a leadership that wants to take Iraq in the right direction. And of course, going back to Bilal's point, the people very much want Iraq to move in that direction as well. Right? And one of the big problems that we've had has been this disconnect between what the people of Iraq want and what their leaders have been willing to do. And again, this is not a slight against Haider al-Abadi. I think that Abadi knew what the people wanted and ultimately wanted to take them there, but wasn't able to do so for a whole variety of reasons. I think that we have another chance with Adel Abdul Mahdi to help him do what Haider al-Abadi wasn't able to do so. But right? It's the Middle East. There's nothing but big buts. Let me start with the buts and why this is such a critical year and why we have to be so concerned. First, Adel doesn't have a power base. Right? ISKI claims him as his own, but the fact of the matter is ISKI is a sad shadow of what it once was, and it's not entirely clear to me that Adel considers himself, to be ISKI, the same way that ISKI considers Adel to be ISKI, and it's just not enough of a base for him to use that to drive the train of the Iraqi government. He is very much a compromise candidate. Someone has agreed to, after months of the usual backroom infighting among all of the different groups, he was ultimately a compromise candidate that they came to almost at the 11th hour, more or less at the 11th hour, right, when they were jockeying based on a whole variety of other candidates and for a variety of reasons agreed on Adel. He's going to be presiding over yet another national unity government. Right? We call this the Mukhassasa system, right? And we make it sound as if somehow that makes it equitable, right? What it does is inevitably produce more national unity governments which are paralyzed because they simply distribute political power among a whole variety of different groups, bring all of the political differences into the government itself, and because no one has ownership of what the government actually does, because it is a national unity government, it becomes only about what they can take from the government and give to their constituents. So all the different parties regard the government as nothing but a massive patronage system. And every ministry that they run becomes their own personal fiefdom, their own personal network. Right? This is what we have seen time and again in Iraq, and it is one of the biggest challenges that Adel is going to face moving forward. Right? And we saw him try in the selection of a cabinet to try to get past that and to try to get a government that was committed to doing things, to a program of activities. And I can't say that he has completely failed, but what I will say is that I am disappointed that he did not succeed so far more than he has. And again, I don't think that that was terribly surprising because of the array of forces against him, but we need to recognize that the inertia is baked into this system. Right? These political parties do not have much of an incentive to actually make serious change in Iraq. There are some who want to do it because I think that they have either enlightened self-interest or they do believe that somehow it will redound to their benefit. But again, they're not the majority of the parties, right, who are not vested in it. Beyond that, again, as Bilal laid out, we've got 3 different communities, all of them deeply aggrieved. All of them deeply aggrieved about completely different issues. Right? So we've got a Kurdish community that is furious about Kirkuk, their second-class citizen status, what is going to happen to them in terms of their security forces, oil, etc. Right? That is their set of concerns. There's a Sunni community that is absolutely desperate for reconstruction after the war against Daesh, that is fearful of the resurgence of Daesh, but equally fearful that they are being completely excluded from political power in Baghdad once again. Right? Mike and I had a number of Sunnis more or less say to us, we lost, right? Our community just lost the second Iraqi civil war, right? And we're trying to find out, what the victors are going to do to the losers. And then finally, we've got a Shia community that Bilal nicely pointed out is absolutely infuriated about the inability of the government to govern and provide basic services and an economic framework for revival to the entire country. Now, all three of these are huge sets of problems, right? Each would be a major set of problems on its own, but please do recognize that the three communities are laser focused on their own set of grievances and really don't care much about the other side's grievances, right? You can draw some bridges between, or build some bridges between the Sunni concern about reconstruction with the Shia concern about lack of government services and economic malaise, right? But they are a little bit tenuous because what the Sunnis are looking for, what the Shia are looking for are very different things. Right? And so each community is completely invested in its own set of problems, isn't terribly interested in the other community's set of problems, isn't terribly interested in making sacrifices on its issues to help one of the other communities with their issues as well. Right? So this compounds the problem several times over. And then finally, and I don't want to tread too much on Nussaibah's toes here, but I do want to mention the Iranians. Right? And our own policy, America's policy toward Iran. Right? We are about to hit the Iranians really hard. Whether it actually convinces the Iranians to come back to the table and strike a new nuclear deal, I don't know. Right? I'm not ready to bet my mortgage that that's going to happen. Whatever else happens, it is going to hurt the Iranian economy very badly, and there is zero question that the Iranians are going to dig their claws even deeper into Iraq. Right, as I said in the Wall Street Journal, the Iraqi economy is the snorkel through which the Iranians breathe under sanctions. They desperately need the Iraqi economy for currency manipulation, for smuggling, and just for legal trade. Right? And the Iranians and the Iraqis are too intertwined for us to force the Iraqis to simply cut off all contact. And Iran's influence in the Iraqi political system is simply too significant to believe that we can shut it out completely. Certainly not at the levels of aid and assistance and energy and input we're providing now. Maybe we could do so with a massive level of commitment, like the surge level of commitment. Right? But I don't see anybody in Washington talking about that. Right? And so we have to think about the fact that the Iranians have a vested interest in keeping this Iraqi government weak and in maintaining the corruption of the Iraqi system. The two things that Adil is there to try to correct, the two most important things that need to happen in Iraq over the next year, the Iranians now have a much greater incentive to try to thwart. Why is all of this important? For exactly the reasons that Bilal mentioned. These three communities are deeply, deeply unhappy. And in particular, the rioting in Basra and elsewhere in the south has got to make us acutely sensitive to the possibility that if Adil fails to deliver and fails to deliver fairly soon, that the Iraqi people are going to lose their faith in the system itself. I would argue that so far what we've seen, and in particular in the election, is the Iraqis losing faith in their leadership, but not in the system. That's why we had this democratic process. That's why we had these peaceful transfers of power, because the Iraqi people still believe in the system. They are hoping that they can get better leaders to lead that system in a different direction. The problem is, if Adel fails, if yet another government fails, if yet another well-intentioned government, a government blessed by the marja'iyah, a government that clearly recognizes what the Iraqi people want, a government that is no longer burdened by the war against ISIS, if that government fails too, there's a real risk that these protests, that these demonstrations, that these riots will turn into something worse. Right? We could see a revolution, and Muqtada is waiting in the wings, trying desperately to be the one who leads that revolution. You could simply see a dissipation of power, with the center becoming increasingly irrelevant and Iraq becoming basically a big set of fiefdoms, a name on a map, no longer a country. You could see another bout of civil war. All of these things are very real scenarios that lie at the end of the roads, that start out with the people deciding after 6 or 12 or maybe 18 months that this government can't do it either. And if this government can't do it either, maybe the problem isn't the leaders, maybe the problem is the system itself. Let me stop there.
On that cheerful note.
We're talking about Iraq here, Bilal.
Exactly. Exactly. I had a piece in the Washington Post in which I was being cheerful, focusing on the first side of my presentation about the opportunities, about what's going right, and I decided to intentionally, maybe for a day, blink about what's wrong, and then I remembered another Ryan Crocker excellent quote that the times that I did not get Iraq right were the times that I was not pessimistic enough. So let's move to Mike Knights. Mike, the task for you today is, if you could please highlight two interrelated issues. One is the relation between KRG and Baghdad, which have long-standing disputes over oil revenue and security, especially in the disputed areas. And talking of disputed areas, how is ISIS insurgency taking advantage of the areas that have changed hands between the Kurdish Peshmerga and the Iraqi military and security forces? So if you could address probably those two interrelated issues, we would be grateful. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much. And I'm just going to check that the sound levels are okay at your end. You sound good?
Yes, we're good.
You hearing me okay, Bilal? Great. Well, first thing, just to lift the mood a little, I want to highlight possibly one of Ken's most quotable lines ever, which is, "This is the Middle East. There's nothing but big butts." So starting with that as a starting point, it's really hard to top that, actually. But I'll talk a little bit about what I see is going on between Baghdad and the Kurdistan region. For me, the issue of Baghdad-Kurdistan relations has always been one of the most important issues, because one transformation that came into Iraq in 2003 was democracy over a fascist dictatorship. But the other major opportunity that was there was for Iraq to be at peace with itself for the first time since its creation, particularly along the Baghdad-Kurdistan fault line. And I still believe that there's tremendous promise there. The US, I think, is also working in this space quite effectively right now, and that is a pleasant thing to think about after some of the stumbles that we've had in recent years and the difficulties that there were around the referendum and the Kirkuk issue. Kirkuk is where I'll start. Kirkuk is, I think, foundational to a deal between the Baghdad and the Kurdistan region, and the US is playing an important role in bringing Kirkuk into this process. Of course, the oil of Kirkuk is what I'm talking about. A collaborative oil export scheme that could bring 300,000 barrels per day of Iraqi oil out onto the world market via the Kurdistan region's common user pipeline system. Iraq can't really export a great deal more oil through the south. The export infrastructure is almost tapped out, but it can quickly bring 300,000 barrels per day of oil through the Kurdistan system and Turkey. Why that matters is because the US wants Turkey to buy less oil from Iran. Turkey wants to have access to more dependable oil supplies. Baghdad wants more money. Baghdad wants to be able to get exports out so it can meet its budget aims in 2019. It will earn itself $6 billion worth of export revenues based on the budgeted oil price, which is itself conservative, so it's probably more than 6. The Kurdistan region will earn a great deal of money if it keeps hold of its Baghdad budget transfers that it's currently receiving. And, you know, these new exports via Kirkuk would double the amount of monthly transfer that Baghdad provides to the Kurdistan region. So in other words, that budget transfer would be to the Kurdistan region would become not only self-sustaining but also quite profitable for Baghdad to do. So the US is pushing on this win-win-win-win-win deal on Kirkuk, and it's really putting a lot of weight behind it, which I'm pleased to see. What that then means for revenue sharing inside the 2019 of what's formally written inside the Iraqi budget, we're likely to see a continuing collaborative oil export scheme between Baghdad and the Kurdistan region in 2019, probably involving the Kurds continuing to self-market their own crude, exporting Baghdad's Kirkuk crude, which it would market itself from Ceyhan, topping up the Kurdistan region budget so that they can continue to not only meet their own salary and social services and oil petroleum costs requirements, but also to do their debt servicing. And currently the Kurdistan region is actually debt servicing at a level of about $200 million a month, which is extremely impressive, and long may it continue. The third thing that's going on between Baghdad and the Kurdistan region is thinking about how they might do joint security mechanisms in disputed areas. And you know, here, the old models of disputed area conflict resolution, I don't think they work. You know, in the old days, 2010, we had overlapping security forces, areas where both the Peshmerga and the Iraqi army were located, and the US military was located as well. So it's easy to do combined security mechanisms involving trilateral forces. Nowadays, if Baghdad wants to get access to areas where it's not currently present, or the Peshmerga want to get back into security operations in some areas where they're not present, somebody has to let the others over the front line, and that's not going to happen. What I think instead is a lot more profitable, and people are starting to think about, is the generation of new joint forces. And there's two basic ideas right now. One is that the counter-terrorism service, the most effective force in Iraq today, which is a Baghdad-controlled force. And we just put out a new, very comprehensive paper on this, on the case. But they're thinking about expanding 2 new counter-terrorism service brigades, one raised in the Sulaymaniyah side of the Kurdistan region, the other raised in the Erbil side of the Kurdistan region. These would nominally be under, and would really be under, federal command and control. They would be resourced through the central government, and they would create forces that could be used on this disputed frontline boundary, because they would have federal elements, they would have some federal troops within, you know, people brought from federal Iraq within them, but they would also have a lot of Kurds within those structures, within very professionalized structures. A final idea on this joint security mechanism is raising new either federal police or Iraqi army divisions for areas to Kirkuk. And to give you a sense of how that would work, you would recruit from, let's say, the Kirkuk area on a basis of 33% Kurds, 33% Arabs, 33% Turkmen, a new Iraqi army or federal police division. That would be locally recruited from that area. This is something we've done in the past, and it worked reasonably well. This is something that could be done in the future, even better, learning from some mistakes in the past and some lessons, and could allow us again to build new forces along that federal KRG crease, which is the area in which ISIS is actually coming back the strongest. A final point I want to mention about Kurdistan right now is the interesting role of Iran in the Kurdistan region right now, and in particular trying to strike up a relationship with the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the KDP party. the Iranians came after Kirkuk and said, we really didn't want to help to smash you at Kirkuk, and the Americans didn't help you, the Turks didn't help you. In the future, we will help you. Let us protect you the same way we protected Assad, the same way we protected Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen. And what they seem to be asking for is a collaborative framework that would prevent any kind of Iranian Kurdish opposition from working out the Kurdistan region, preventing making sure the Kurds don't drop any problems again about referendums or independence, but also clearly trying to access hard currency and external markets, even under conditions of US sanctions. This is something that everyone needs to watch very carefully. The Kurdistan region earns about $1 billion a month in oil exports, and those are in dollars. Iran would love to get access to $1 billion worth of hard currency a month, and the Kurdistan region is already taking that money and turning it into dinars. So that's the kind of transaction that needs to be watched very closely from now on. I'm encouraged by the fact that I think the US is weighing in heavily enough on issues like Kirkuk, collaborative export schemes, revenue sharing, and military support to the Peshmerga at the moment, that I don't think the Kurds are going to take any kind of short-sighted actions that could put them on the wrong side of a US sanctions regime. But that's something that I'd watch very closely. Bilal, do you want me to talk very quickly about this now, or you want to save it for Q&A?
If there's a final point you want to make, otherwise we can come back to it during Q&A. Your call.
Okay, so I'll just set the scene a bit, and then we can dig down in Q&A. I'd say that, the Operation Infinite Resolve was, the objective of that operation was to get ISIS back to 2012, basically, 2012 levels, not controlling cities, etc. The ISIS plan, as they've put it in their own internal communications, is to start again from 2012. We're back in 2012. Except we do not have a permissive environment for them in Syria yet. We do not have a shattered Iraqi security forces whose commanders have been politicized yet. And we do not have an ejected or withdrawn US military presence in Iraq yet. So, we're back in 2012, and we can either move in the right direction or we can move in the wrong directions. We're doing a new metrics-based analysis at the Washington Institute in West Point Combating Terrorism Center, CTC Sentinel, which should come out in the December issue, I think. We did this before with CTC Sentinel, and the last set of metrics showed us that ISIS had made a very agile transformation back to insurgent movement in every area where they had been forced to relinquish control of territory. Back then, Diyala, Salahuddin, Anbar, and the Baghdad belts to a worrying extent. This time, just doing the initial data cuts. Of course, this time we involve Kirkuk, Nineveh province, and the Jazeera, the areas of Anbar and Nineveh that are, right up on the Syrian border, as well as Diyala and these other provinces. What we can see is this. Quantitatively, ISIS may have dropped their tempo a little in Iraq, but qualitatively, they're raising their game a great deal. That's both in targeting individuals where you kill one man, but you have massive effect. You intimidate everyone in a 2,000, 5,000 village, such as execution of Muqtars, local leaders. So they're carving out a sanctuary for themselves in which people don't dare to resist them. The security forces are making some significant errors in some of these areas, and they're just too overstretched. The security forces need to be a lot bigger to create that kind of security blanket for local populations that doesn't exist right now. They also need to be locally recruited and empowered and led. ISIS forces are starting to undertake what you might call external operations. Then close-range external operations. To give one example, the Hawija pocket, just outside of Kirkuk, rural Sunni populated farmlands, the ISIS mini vilayat in there is conceiving of, supporting, and ordering long-range strike operations in places like the Kurdistan region, where recently a cell was detected having planned hit a local Western consulate and also an embassy, luckily plotted. But that shows you how even a small micro caliphate a little kind of individual vilayat can recover to the extent where it starts to look outside itself and starts to undertake bombing attacks on major cities and other areas. Also, the final thing to think about here is that, we've just seen ISIS try and do a movement, an operational level movement of forces from Syria into Iraq. I could easily see ISIS relocate the bulk of its fighting forces in Syria and disperse them across northern Iraq. That would be a very significant shot in the arm for the insurgency inside Iraq. So there's a very tough government moving forward right now about this. They have no Minister of Interior, they have no Minister of Defence, and they have no National Security Advisor. The Prime Minister is a very brave guy. I remember him helicoptering into Beji refinery when it was surrounded by ISIS, as when he was oil minister in 2014. And he himself has nearly been killed by Islamic State fighters and their antecedents in the past in 2007. He's not a military leader. He has to feel his way into this role of military. It's about whether ISIS will recover quite strongly in the year or two to come.
All right, Mike, thank you very much. You broke up for a few seconds toward the end. I guess that was a signal from the ethers, but we'll get back to you because you raised some very interesting points, and I'd like to get back to you, especially with regards to how can the U.S. help the new Iraqi team with these new security challenges. Nussaibah, on to you, last but definitely not least. We looked at the trees and Ken and Mike, the details, the actors, the challenges and dynamics. But how is Iraq overall is seen from the region, from Turkey, from Iran, and perhaps more interestingly from the Gulf countries, which has had recent overtures towards Iraq, but now I guess they have their own problems and they're getting sort of busier. So if you could highlight that, and then I'd also like to give you the opportunity to maybe plug some very interesting programming that you're doing in Iraq, especially with the youth. So I'd love to, on behalf of the audience, to hear about that as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this new Iraqi government that we're seeing forming, and to what extent has Iran versus the US been successful in influencing this government formation process. Now, we saw in the recent months before Adil Abdul Mahdi was selected and his cabinet announced, we saw a great deal of energy and jockeying from the United States and Iran in Baghdad and efforts to influence the outcome. And there's been some very mixed interpretations following the announcement of these key characters. Now, I think partly because Dr. Barham Saleh and Adil Abdul Mahdi are very much known quantities in Washington. We, in the US government, have long-standing relationships with both of them. We know them very well. We've worked with them in the past. They speak English. They speak the language of reform that we very much enjoy. And I think there's, because of their positive attributes, which they do have, and I don't want to downplay that, because of their positive attributes, I think there's been a bit of a tendency to see this new government as something of a success for the United States. And I do believe that we have an opportunity to do positive work with these leaders, but I don't believe that government formation was influenced successfully by the United States. I think what we've seen is self-moderation, strategic self-moderation from the Iranians in a government formation process in which they came out on top and they were extremely influential. I mean, to take the case of Dr. Barham Saleh, very experienced individual. I think there is a lot of positive things he can do, but ultimately he came out of the Iraqi elections, the parliamentary elections in May, in an extremely weak position. his political party gained only a couple of seats. He was alleging widespread irregularities and fraud in the polls up in the Kurdistan region, with some real evidence. And it was the Iranians who brokered his return to the PUK. That was not a US strategy or an approach. We weren't involved in that. It was the Iranians who very actively brokered, essentially the dissolution of this new opposition political party in the Kurdistan region, which was a very difficult ask of Dr. Barham. He'd committed huge resources and his personal reputation and on that party, had developed a real constituency for it. And for him to go back to the PUK required external intervention and external guarantees that the Iranians were involved with intimately. Now there's an interpretation that somehow what happened when Barham Saleh was chosen as president over Fuad Hussein was some kind of mass rebellion of Iraqi MPs who chose Barham Saleh because they are passionate about him, rather than choosing Fuad Hussein, who was the Iranian candidate. Just because Fuad Hussein was backed by Fatah does not mean he was the Iranian candidate. The Iranians played a smarter game than that. They have been working with bringing Barham Saleh back into the political game and shutting down some of the space for opposition politics in the KRG and consolidating PUK rule in the Sulaymaniyah region. This is part of a bigger strategy. Now, that's not to undermine who Dr. Barham is and what his potential is in this position. I think we can work with him and we should work with him. And I think there's a lot he can do. And I think it's a positive thing that he's in the role. I think it's also important for us to recognize and not be kind of, not to have the wool pulled over our eyes here about what our role was in bringing him to this position. We did not have a role in bringing him to this position. In fact, until the very last minute, Brett McGurk, by reports that I've heard, was very much pressuring Dr. Barham to withdraw in favor of Fuad Hussein. So it's not our candidate who's in the presidency. He knows it, I would imagine, having been told by us to step down. And so I think we need to be very aware of that. Now, similarly, with Adil Abdel Mahdi, yes, the US has worked with him extensively in the past in all of his different capacities as vice president, as minister of oil. He speaks great English, he's an economist, lots of things that we like about him. But the US strategy on government formation was to stick to supporting Abadi's candidacy for the prime ministership until beyond all reasonable analysis of the situation. Beyond the point where the Marja'iyya had withdrawn their support, beyond the point where protesters in Basra had made it very clear that they were not going to allow a second term for Abadi. My understanding is the US was basically still committed to his second term. So I think we lost an opportunity by not being agile and nimble enough to read the mood of the street, to read the mood of the political scene, and to find another candidate who could then at least have some allegiance to us, knowing that we'd played a role in helping to secure his future, instead of very clearly just being outmaneuvered. Now, I think the Iranians have done some extraordinary political work in the last few months in building an alliance the likes of which we could never have expected would be possible. We've seen Binat, which is this alliance that's built up around Fatah, which is this, the political wing of a number of the militias. We've seen Sunnis like Khamis al-Khanjar from the really right wing of the Sunni political establishment who rail against the Hashid being brought in to the Bina coalition by the Iranians. This isn't Hadi al-Amri's like diplomatic touch. This is Iranian brokerage, right? It's power play. It's putting down on the table real leverage over some of the most extreme opponents of these Hashid groups and of the Hashid political parties. Now, similarly with the KDP, and Mike referenced this, and we talked about this on our last trip report panel a few months ago, the Iranians have done significant, very sustained diplomatic outreach to the KDP since the retaking of Kirkuk to try and persuade the KDP that their political future and the guarantee of a level of autonomy from Baghdad, that guarantee is going to come through Iran and not through the United States. And they've managed to really persuade the KDP to ally with Fatah, even though they screwed Fuad Hussein out of the presidency. And yet still, such has been the level of Iranian leverage on the table and the consistency of their persuasive efforts that they've built just a few months after the Hashid helped to forcibly take Kirkuk out of the hands of the Kurds. Now you have major Kurdish support for the Hashid-related parties. It's an achievement. You've got to admire what the kind of characters they've gone after and have been able to successfully draw over into this wing of Iraqi politics. Now, my belief is the Iranians have deliberately chosen not to use the political leverage that they have in Iraqi politics to its fullest extent, partly because I don't think they want to humiliate the United States internationally to the point where the US imposes greater restrictions on Iraq, to the point where the US starts to treat Iraq as an enemy. Because from an economic perspective, given the reimposition of sanctions, it's very important for the Iranian economy that the Iraqi economy still has full free access to the global economy and still has positive relationships with the United States, right? So making a statement by really pulling on all of this leverage and forcing Hadi al-Amri into the prime minister position would have been too much of a statement, would have invited a backlash. It wasn't the smart move. I don't think that means that the Iranians weren't capable of doing it. The other thing is, I do think there is some Iranian sensitivity to local Iraqi politics. I do think that the demonstrations in Basra, the scale, the violence, the burning of the Iranian embassy, though there's a lot of conspiracy theories in Iran about who is behind that, I do think there's some recognition that there needs to be a SOP to the Iraqi public, a new government that offers some technocratic edge, that seeks to respond in some way, not only to the protesters but also to the Marja'iyya, who made their red lines pretty clear here. Now, the Marja'iyya, I don't think, are very happy with this. Adil Abdul Mahdi, they said no new faces. This guy's been around for more than a decade. He's not a new face. But given the range of possibilities, they're taking a step back. They're going to give it a chance. But I think there were, they took into consideration also the electoral weight of Sairun, of course, also played into Iranian considerations here. What you don't want to do is steamroll over Sairun and exclude them from government or make them feel that they don't have a stake in the new Iraqi government, such that they ally with the street, with protesters on the street. That would be an explosive combination. I do think there's a recognition in Iran that Sairun needed to be fully participating in government and identified with the new government. So there are domestic considerations here, but I do think looking to the US and positioning themselves in relation to the US, given the new threats posed by sanctions has been a big part of this. Now, I was asked to really take this kind of broad view and look at the regional, look at the international political dimension of this, which is why I'm really emphasizing the Iranian role here. I also would like to just point out that I recognize there are a lot of local factors, and I don't wish to underplay Iraqi autonomy here, but just bringing to play the Iranian and US dimension. Those would be my observations.
Thank you very much. I invite the panel actually to maybe comment on each other's presentations. I think the role of Iran is quite intricate, and one version of it is what Nussaibah eloquently presented. There are others. I'm just going to put it out there that probably would disagree with you by saying that Iran is generally better than the United States in taking credit for things that happen on the ground anyways. The U.S. is not in that, but I agree with some, if not all, of the analysis that you offered on Iran. But I think I go back to the point that I made earlier, and then the Ryan Crocker quotation here is that the crossroad element of the Iran influence here is that Iran is very tacked at exploiting the personal and transactional Iraqi politics. But when it comes to the demands of the public, the pressures that the political parties are under, Iran has very little to offer. I mean, let's just look at electricity. What can Iran do? Let's look at power generation, the corruption in the government. In fact, I would argue the counter, that the reason why Iran is so influential is because there is lack of accountability. A government of everyone, and the unity government is usually a government of no one. So if there is no one to hold accountable, maybe the public in Basra would go and just burn everything, which is not the most civil and peaceful way of protest. But that is where I think, and Nussaibah, you pointed this out, that the Iraqi sense of independence and unity is in clash with this level of influence. Now, the Iranians are, of course, smart. They're not, beating their chests as they used to in the past. But I think that is the challenge, and that also poses a question to U.S. influence, whether U.S. will disengage just because the war on ISIS is winding down, or will the United States step in more politically and economically? I know that in your Wall Street Journal article you argue for a $1 billion to $2 billion aid that the U.S. should provide to the new team and to the Iraqi government. I mean, that's an area. One public demand is economic reform. I think Iran has very little to offer the Iraqi government by way of the kind of reform aid and packages that the IMF and the World Bank are offering. So this sort of cat and mouse, rivalry in Iraq between the U.S. and Iran continue. And obviously, Nussaibah, you pointed out very well how smart the Iranian side is and the kind of games that they play in the country. In 2 minutes, I'd like just to offer some comments about the Kurdish elections that I monitored, and then I'll go ask my co-panelists a question each, and then I'll get to your questions, the audience. Very briefly, KRG elections were among the most peaceful that happened probably in Kurdistan's history. The level of political violence that has happened in previous episodes of elections were almost non-existent in comparison. The process was a rather good process. I mean, I, as an observer, did not see many of the problems and challenges that I had seen in previous elections. For example, I didn't see a lot of armed people storming polling stations. I did not see intimidation. I did not see party officials outside the polling stations trying to give people the stare or illegally campaign ahead of the elections. Some of these sort of scenes that were not there. I think the Kurdistan Electoral Commission, which is the first time it actually managed an election, have done their homework in looking at the past elections, finding all of the loopholes, and then trying to run a clean election. And here comes the but. Turnout was low, was very low, probably even lower than the Iraqi elections. I did not see a lot of young people vote. The process looked good, but later on, when I came home and I switched on the TV, and I then saw the news that, well, okay, maybe the polling stations, and I viewed 12, and I have my buddy here. What is Jackson? Right there. He was with me. We visited about 12 polling stations in rich neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, and also we went outside of the town, places where, usually international observers don't go. We're trying to be sneaky. But the process was good. And then later we learned that, the ruling parties, because they have the wherewithals, and again, these are all accusations, they're very difficult for any international observer to verify these accusations. But if the people believe it, then that's what matters. So the public believes that the KDP and the PUK, the two ruling parties, have used their position in government to print fake IDs and then send their supporters to go and vote on behalf of people that they would know that are not willing to vote. Some people went and they realized that, oh, someone has already voted on their behalf already. I mean, so that form of fraud was seems to be the one that was widely used in this round of election. The campaign was personal and tribal, but the political parties still played an important role. What is interesting is that, unlike Iraqi politics, which Ken described, the dynamism, the responsiveness of the parties to the wants and demands of the public, an election that was, also had low turnout and had a lot of, fraud accusations against it. The political parties were more attuned in the government formation. They were more responsible. That is not the case in Kurdistan. I think the KDP and the PUK, despite several blunders, including the economy that's not in good shape, and there were public protests last year. Obviously, the referendum and all of the deep impacts of the referendum that the region is still recovering from. The KDP and the PUK came on top of the elections. In fact, the KDP that was the champion of the referendum actually won more seats. I mean, you would imagine that the party that has endeavored a project that resulted in Kurdistan losing half of the territory that it once controlled and half of the oil that it once exported would probably lose some public favor. And actually that's not the case. They actually won more seats. So one then has to ask, all right, so what is going on here? Do the people don't care, or is there something wrong with this picture? So that basically demonstrates that the two ruling parties are investing in their party institutions. One of the people that I interviewed bragged to me that his party has 500,000 card-holding members. So the party apparatus is very influential and therefore very powerful, and in a way that makes politics in Kurdistan less dynamic, more fixed. But on the other hand of this is that gives you more stability. As was mentioned, Iran and the U.S., they have clear counterparts in Kurdistan. Election or not, the names are the same, the faces are the same, the parties are the same. So maybe that is the flip side of having a less dynamic political scene than you have in the rest of the country. The other maybe highlight from the Kurdish elections is the complete knockdown of the Kurdish opposition. The Kurdish opposition in Kurdistan has become very weak, and this is true throughout all of the political parties. And all of the opposition parties together have lost more seats than in the past in favor of the KDP and the PUK. And now that they are weak, and the KDP and the PUK relation over Kirkuk and over the referendum is not as good as it was before the referendum. A weakened opposition party is all of a sudden more attractive to be part of a government in order to give it a facelift, make it look more inclusive. But governance in Kurdistan is basically, unlike Iraqi politics where accountability is elusive, the buck stops with the KDP and the PUK. And many of the challenges that Iraq at large has, KRG also has, but at least their accountability is very clear, and the fingers are clearly pointed toward these two political parties. And we'll see the first session of the parliament will be November 7th, and the government will probably be a KDP-led government with obviously participation from the PUK and, as I said, some token participation from the opposition. The new team will be in place to address all of the challenges that my colleague Mike Knights mentioned, the questions of security in the disputed territories, the question of oil and gas management, as well as sharing the revenues from those resources. The other challenge, maybe I should close with this, is that this new KRG will have to deal with another source of pressure, and that's pressure from Iran and from Turkey. Iran has become increasingly aggressive against its own Kurdish opposition that has found safe haven in Iraqi Kurdistan. You remember a couple of months ago, they hit the KDPI headquarters with 7 cruise missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, and they caused quite a damage, but it was more of a symbolic message that Iran was sending to its opposition. And the pressure on the Kurdish government and, of course, their own opposition is going to only continue and increase. On the Turkish side, the Turkish military presence inside Iraqi Kurdistan, inside Iraq, is increasing. We might see a more escalation against the PKK, including perhaps using Iraqi Kurdistan territories as a land bridge for those troops to attack Qandil, where the headquarters of the PKK is. Okay, I'm going to step back into my moderation role and ask my colleagues questions, and feel free to jump at the question however you like. This is not pointed to either of you. One issue that we touched upon but we did not discuss at enough length, and that's the question of the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the Shia militias. Now, of course, they did very well in the Iraqi elections. In fact, Asaib Ahl al-Haq went from having 1 seat to 15. So that is one political party that is cashing in on the fight against ISIS. Now, well, partly. How about that? Well, first, why did the militia groups do so well? I mean, again, Fatah was the coalition of the majority of the militias, and they came in second, defeating many of the classical Iraqi political parties. Why did Fatah do so well? And since some of the names that are associated with these militias are going to be sanctioned by the United States, how is the United States going to deal with a government that is going to have officials, perhaps ministers, that are closely linked to Iran, and if not, and perhaps closely linked to groups that are on U.S. sanction list?
Well, Mike wrote that piece about smart sanctions.
All right, Mike.
I'm pointing at you, Mike.
There you go. They outsourced the answer to you, which is a very decent.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So, I didn't mention the Popular Mobilization Forces for a couple of reasons. One is because I think we've thought a lot about them in Washington, D.C., and most of the thinking has been pretty low quality. It's not drawn from a view inside Iraq that, it doesn't reflect how Iraqis feel about, also deflect what's possible within certain timeframes on the Popular Mobilization Forces. I think that thinking is going to pick up again, and from a more pragmatic perspective, driven by the US country team and Combined Joint Task Force and other allies. I think we're probably into the situation now where there's going to be some kind of quick reversal of the Popular Mobilization Force phenomena. It's with us to stay for a while, and as allies, we just have to signal what we're willing to do or not do with those units, and we can provide support to Iraqi institutions, defense institutions, to enable Iraq to make use of that have been kind of mobilized by this phenomena. In the long run, it doesn't make sense for Iraq to have a new security institution when none of its existing security institutions, for instance, have reserve components, which is totally mad for a country the size of Iraq that periodically has horrendous security emergencies when you would want to reactivate trained reserves. That's how the popular mobilization forces happened, because Iraq didn't have reserve forces when it needed them at that exact moment. So, you know, from my perspective, the most valuable stuff we could do is to support institutional development and strengthening within the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defence, the CTS Counterterrorism Service, the National Security Advisor's Office, which obviously has a direct control over the popular mobilization forces, nominally border forces, things like that. You know, we need to stay in this space and compete with the Iranians on security cooperation, and we'll beat the pants off them every time if we do that, because our security cooperation is valued a great deal more than Iran's security cooperation inside Iraq. When it comes to the issue of sanctioning, you know, I've looked for a long time at the issue of, for instance, sanctioning Nussaibah al-Haq or its leadership, and I've called for it in the past. One thing that I'm really, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this year, because Iraqis can make some very compelling arguments about why you would not want to sanction an entire movement such as Nussaibah al-Haq, which has, in the course of the war against ISIS, drawn in very significant numbers of new volunteers who never did fight, you know, US or British forces in the past, and who were there primarily to fight ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. And you know, the Iraqi argument is, don't push those people towards the leadership, don't lump them all together. Instead, you know, let them drift apart from each other over time, as Nussaibah al-Haq is drawn into the political process and becomes a kind of, you know, fat, corrupt political party like all the others, and loses its revolutionary character. Now, for us in Washington, you know, the gut reaction to that is, yeah, but what if they don't? You know, what if they're like Badr and they just spread throughout the whole system and end up controlling everything? And the Iraqi argument is, yeah, we want them to be like Badr. Look, Badr's not as crazy as it was 5-10 years ago. Badr's a bit more of a conservative institution. It's remembering a bit more about being Iraqi nationalist. And, you know, so we've got a fundamental difference of approach, ourselves and the Iraqi government. You know, the Iraqis say embrace and splinter these popular mobilization force elements, and you know, dissolve them back into Iraq, its political and military structures. You know, our view is, no, isn't there something we could do right now, at least to signal that we don't like them and we don't want them in the cabinet? I must say I'm very split, you know, on the issue. I can see positives to sanctioning AAH. I think there's definite positives to sanctioning Nussaibah. Nothing to lose by doing that, because those guys don't want to be in the political process anyway, and they are axis of resistance until the day they die. Nussaibah al-Haq, I think we should engage in much closer dialogue with the Iraqi government about this. You know, there's a strong counter argument that if we let them start moving down the path of, you know, a political movement with political wings that you can't touch, then you start hitting a lot of the same problems we have with Hezbollah and, for instance, European treatment of Hezbollah. It's just something the US government should think a lot harder about and have a lot of in-depth Iraqi government about.
I might just jump in quickly on this as well. From the Iranian perspective, and I had a really interesting conversation this week with a visiting professor who's come from Tehran University. From the Iranian perspective, the two priorities in Iraq are, number one, preservation of the Hashid, and number two, using Iraq as a way of busting sanctions informally. Now, on the preservation of the Hashid side, the way in which they conceive of the Hashid is as a counterbalance, as a way of hedging against Iraqi security forces who are very closely enmeshed with the United States, with the train and equip mission of the United States. So Iran sees the set of security forces that has a very close and long-standing set of relationships with the US. And the hedge against that is to maintain this parallel set of security forces within the state who don't have relationships with the United States. And they don't, because we won't have anything to do with them. And so what Iran has is this kind of alternative armed force that they see from a defensive perspective as a way of preventing the Iraqi military from being solely a US allied kind of element of the Iraqi institution. So I think that's something that's important to bear in mind. One other point I'll make, and I think we'll get into this in further conversation, is there has been a campaign of assassinations against civil society activists in Basra. And when I run a big leadership fellows program in Iraq. I work with a lot of young Iraqi change makers. And I've spoken to some who've had their lives threatened, who are now taking refuge, who are in hiding. And there have been a lot of fingers pointed at Kataib Hezbollah. And I think it's going to be very interesting how the Hashid develops if it's not able to restrain the more extreme actors within its ranks. Because once you start to get popular local backlash against the Hashid actors, not just from Sunni areas where you expect it, but from Shia areas, that's a game changer. So that's, I would say, something that's very important to watch out for.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. All right, let's get to your questions this time. We have mics in the room, so please raise your hand. I'll recognize you, and then please identify yourself, perhaps your affiliation, and ask a question. Safira Rahim.
Thank you very much for 3 excellent presentations, none of which is very comforting. I don't know which one is the more scary. But Nussaibah, could you speculate on why it is that Iran can outmaneuver the U.S. so well and so frequently? And can you referred to the right direction several times? What do you mean? How do you define right direction? I'd love to ask Michael Knight's question, but I'll desist here.
What's that last bit? How do I define what? The right direction. The right direction.
Ken kept referring to the phrase right direction.
Right.
And may I encourage you to do like short answers, please, to my colleagues.
Okay. Why can Iran outmaneuver the US? Because they care a lot more. It's existential. It's existential. This is a neighboring country, one of very few countries in the world in which they have extensive good relationships. It's an outlet for the Iranian economy at a time when the economy is under vast pressure. It's a question of survival. So it is right up there on the priority list. They put resources into it. They have dedicated teams who have worked on this issue for years, who build very close relationships deep within the political establishment. They listen to what Iraqi politicians need. They provide a lot of personal favors. They're willing to do things that we're not willing to do to advance people's personal careers. But I think ultimately it's a question of will. I don't think we're incapable. I do not believe the US is incapable of playing the game at the level that the Iranians do, if it was something that we were interested in doing, if it mattered enough, if it was worth the resources, and if it got high enough political attention, high-level strategic political influence behind it in the way that the Iranians have it. I think that's what it comes down to.
Thank you. Ken?
Very briefly, Ren, first I just want to emphasize one of the points that Nussaibah made there. Resources, right? You know, we've had very skillful diplomats in Baghdad. We've had unskillful diplomats in Baghdad. Even when we have very skillful ones, if they don't have any cards in their hand, they can't win, right? And the problem is, for the last 10 years, we've not put any cards in their hands. The Iranians always come in with lots of cards. What's the right direction? Bilal's asking me to be brief because, yes, I could talk about this all afternoon. As you know, I'll be very brief. It would be about curbing corruption at all levels, economic and political. This isn't going to happen overnight, I recognize that, but you want to start in this direction, move toward a more meritocratic bureaucracy, one that is actually concerned with governing and providing for the citizenry, rather than simply lining its own pockets and lining those of its political leaders and constituents. Wider political and economic reform to include things like regulatory reform, e-government, e-commerce, right? There's a whole series of things that you would want to do to make the Iraqi government more responsive to the needs of the people, right? You want to build the first government in the Arab world that actually is there to serve the people instead of serving itself, right? And that's a real possibility in Iraq. You could do that. That's certainly what the people want. And then you want to build an economy that is actually functional and that takes advantages of all of the resources that Iraq has that we've been all talking about for, if not 15 years, 20 or 25 or 30, which are all true. But they're not able, the Iraqis aren't able to take advantage of those resources because of the corruption, the degeneracy of that wider system. So that's the broadest answer I can give. Again, I've written about this any number of times, so for those who are interested, you can drill down there if you'd like. And Ren, always glad to sit and have a cup of coffee with you and talk in greater specifics about what we should be trying to do there.
Thank you very much. Let's get to another question. Dave.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to preface my question with a shameless advertisement for the next policy forum on Iraq, which will be on November 14th, and I will host it with an Iraqi public opinion pollster, and who will look at some actual hard data, numbers about what Iraqi people from different parts of the country are thinking about all of this. And so I want to ask you, how much does that matter? The election is over. The riots have subsided, which is one expression of public opinion, I suppose. And so now, at this point, does it matter? Or in what ways does it matter what ordinary people in Iraq would like or think? Mike Knights, for example, said, I think it was Mike, who said that U.S. security assistance is valued more than Iran's security assistance. What's the evidence for that? And are we talking here about just the professional military, or are we talking about the popular perception on the street about connections with the United States versus connections with Iran? Public opinion, that's my question. Thank you.
Mike, I'll give you the platform. I think you were pinged.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so just on security cooperation being more valued, it's obviously an elite point of view that I'm putting across. But, in Iraq, the elites are still extremely powerful. I mean, the strength of a politician sometimes is judged according to how well he can do the rodeo ride or surf, the next wave of public discontent in Iraq. Often the public doesn't really have a lot of impact on the elites at all, but the public has an elite on the marja'iyah, and then they have an effect on the political track sometimes. So, that's the dynamic that politicians have to worry about most. I think also, just as an aside, we will have provincial elections coming up at some point in 2019. And that gives the public another opportunity to hit politicians and hit parties and hit, and that's sometimes local issues can have more effect. You actually get more issue-based sort of politics emerging in the provincial elections than you do in others sometimes. On the security cooperation, this is unabashedly an elite view. This is the preference that Iraqi military, security forces leaders, and also, political bloc leaders will express, even, quietly sadrists. They know that the kind of air power, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, training capabilities that the coalition brings to bear they're unparalleled, and that they have very significant impact getting at ISIS, particularly getting at ISIS leadership. And, they've seen this so many times. Many of these groups, they've also been on the receiving end of US intelligence and US firepower, and they have a pretty healthy respect, even, including, for instance, until recently, who's a good candidate, a likely candidate at least, for national security advisor in Iraq, a guy who was in US prisons for 26 months. He knows the US system from the other side, and he has an extremely healthy regard for what the US and also now the allies that the US has drawn into Iraq could do, particularly the Italians, the Spanish, Portuguese, the Australians, New Zealanders, the Germans. You know, these guys are right there alongside us doing the bulk of the training. So I don't think I need an opinion poll to tell me that the Iraqi system will prefer to work with the US military and allies rather than another. The question is as to whether Iraqi public opinion can get at the parliamentary debate, and whether it can get at the actions of political parties on an issue like continuation of US security force assistance in the country. Yeah, that's something that maybe your pollster will be able to shed light on. But I'm just not sure that, other than being reflected through the marja'iyah, that you get a big impact of public views on individual policy issues.
To jump quickly, I'll pick up where Mike left off. By and large, David, I think what we've seen is that popular opinion doesn't have nearly as much of an impact in Iraq as certainly the Iraqi public, I think many other people would like it to have, right? Because of inbuilt problems with the Constitution, with proportional representation, with Judge Medhat's awful ruling in 2010, right? All of this has worked to basically insulate Iraqi politics from popular opinion, right? We have an election. We see what the Iraqi people want. Then the elites retreat behind closed doors, and they produce a government that typically has nothing to do with what the people voted for. Okay, and that's very unfortunate. That said, I do think that there's stuff that's going on now that's making it more important. Right? The first is, back to Bill's original points, the depth of unhappiness, especially among the Shia, right, which everyone has had to take note of. It has mobilized the marja'iyah in ways that they hadn't beforehand, right? They are taking action, and as Mike points out, when the marja'iyah speaks, people do listen. And let's be careful. They don't always do what the marja'iyah says, right? I can start spouting off any number of fatwas from Grand Ayatollah Sistani that previous Iraqi governments just completely ignored, right? But it's not like they have no impact either. Right, so that is important. Second, because of this potential for revolution, I think that is starting to get people's attention, and people are starting to focus on that, including the marja'iyah. And then the last point I'll make is, one of the interesting things for me is whenever I go and meet and talk to these Iraqi political leaders, even those who we might like least, they almost always want to be popular, right? Hadi al-Amri doesn't want to be the strong man forcing Iraqis to do things they don't want to do. And, he goes out of his way to try to convince you that what he wants to do is very much consonant with the Iraqi people, right? And, I think they're very proud of the number of seats that they won for exactly that reason. And what that speaks to is I think that if there were more public opinion polling in Iraq, and it was better known, and it was more reliable, right? And you could get it out there, and the press was better. One of the nice things about Iraq is we do have a pretty free press in Iraq, right? I actually think that could have much more of an impact, because I think that these guys would be very embarrassed if a reporter said to them, the Iraqi people, showed that by 89% they hate your policies. Why do you continue to push them?
Right.
That'd be positive.
So what you're saying is everybody should come to my policy forum on November 14th.
Yeah, right. If you didn't get that, that was the subtext of my entire answer.
Yeah, no, though, I would just add one point. I mean, when I was talking about the KRG elections, I literally said that because the political parties are, strongly in power, solidified their power, therefore elections are rendered, insignificant. So yes, one party that's responsible for the referendum wins. The other party that is, accused in Iraqi media for, losing Kirkuk, they use the word like betrayal. They have a comeback from the elections. So yeah, elections probably don't matter that much. But you know what matters? All of these, failures and what I call blunders didn't bring people public to the street. Yeah. But when the Iraqi government transferred money to the Kurdish government, and the Kurdish government still failed to pay the salaries on time, that's when you had teachers and nurses come to the street and protest and basically braved whatever, political might and security might than the KDP and the PUK have. And that's when the government had no chance but to actually pay the salaries on time. So public opinion matters. It just depends on, where do you scratch the public. Let me get another question. Kak Dilman, right here, the first.
Thank you. My name is Dilman Abdelkader, Director of the Kurdistan Project at the Endowment for Middle East Truth. I have two quick questions. My first question is for Dr. Knights regarding Kirkuk. You didn't mention Article 140, and my question is, why won't the Iraqi government implement Article 140? Is there a fear? What is the setback? And why is there the need for example, joint forces in Kirkuk if we can solve the issue through Article 140? And my second question is to Dr. Younis. You mentioned Iranian influence and how Iranian positions certain actors to win the elections. But what about the election results? What about the Basra demands, the large protests? There seems to be a gap between the people and the results of the elections. So is this new Iraqi government set to serve Iran or the Iraqi people? Thank you.
All right, I'd like to take a crack at that. Mike? Go ahead.
I'll kick off. So I didn't mention Article 140 because I don't mention everything about Iraq in every speech I do. I am focused on what can be done in the near term. And, Article 140 is a complex process. Census, normalization, working out who should be in these places, relocation of people, administrative referendums on administrative changes to boundaries within the country. That's a lot of work. You've got to start somewhere. And you can't wait until all those things are done to stop ISIS from regrowing in the Kirkuk area. You need something that begins happening right now, such as creating new cross-sectarian or cross-ethnic forces on the ground at this very moment, getting Kirkuk exports up and running, getting money to the Kurdistan region, and creating a basis for future cooperation. Article 140 should have been executed, should have been done. It wasn't done. I hope the ideas in it can be brought back again, but we need to start somewhere in the near term.
So I don't believe that the Iranian government controls the Iraqi government at all. I do think that what they've managed to do through being very active in government formation is ensure they have sufficient leverage that their key objectives can be achieved, namely that the Hashid will be protected as an institution and will continue to grow in its institutional, if not legitimacy, at least in its kind of relationship, will develop a relationship with the state, relationships of funding, will develop processes around it, will become embedded in a way that it becomes a permanent Iraqi institution. So I think they'll be able to achieve that objective. I also think they'll be able to achieve a substantial amount in terms of informal sanctions busting through Iraq, whether it's through smuggling, whether it's through accessing hard currency through Iraq's currency exchanges. I think the Iraqi government will turn a blind eye to Iranian informal economic activity in the country. So I think on those two key issues, the Iranians are going to be successful in using their leverage in Iraqi politics. The Iranians don't seek to control or define many spheres of Iraqi politics. There's a lot of policy, particularly on domestic governance and domestic governance issues, on domestic kind of economic issues, where I think the Iraqi government will have a lot of flexibility to pursue whatever it wants. And the Iranians, I don't think, will seek to be involved.
In fact, on Iran, so we're all members of a WhatsApp group by the Rafidain Dialogue Center, and I have a question from one of our fellow members, Farhad Aladdin, who's basically asking the panel. I guess I'll probably just have you speak for the panel in this case, Ken. What advice would you give to the Iraqi government regarding the sanctions? And I should also mention that you have a series of articles about Iranian influence in the region, including Iraq. So what would you advise on how the Iraqi government, the new team, should handle the sort of double pressures, the pressures from Iran that Nussaibah outlined, and obviously the pressures from the United States, which Mike Knights outlined on Iraq, to stop Iran from using Iraq as a sanction-busting vehicle, or you called it the snorkel.
Sure. Great question, Kak Farhad. And Bilal, I'm going to answer. I would never give advice to a foreign government about how to handle the United States. I'll simply give it from an American perspective, which is that, from an American perspective, I very much worry about the kind of pressure that we're trying to bring to bear against Iraq, and trying to force them to pick us or the Iranians. First, I think that that's a mistake on our part. Second, I'm afraid the Iraqis will choose Iran if we actually force them to do so.
I see.
Right? Unless we are going to come forward with massive aid programs that would in effect allow them to compensate for all of the trade, licit and illicit, that they get from Iran, and also provide, the people who want to side with the United States, the more pro-American Iraqis, unless you're going to give them enough ammunition, and I mean that almost literally, but mostly figuratively, to fight against everybody else, right? This is going to be a losing proposition. The Iraqi economy is simply too bound up with Iran. So I think that the great mistake is in the United States trying to force Iraq to do that. I am hopeful, and I will stick with that word, hopeful, that this administration will recognize that this is not a good idea with Iraq, that there are lots of countries around the world who we can go to, and as the President and the Secretary of State have both said at different points in time, you get a choice. You can either trade with the Iranians or you can trade with the world's single largest integrated economy, right? It's a no-brainer for 99% of the countries in the world. In the case of Iraq, it's not a no-brainer. And in fact, it may be that Iraq is one of the very few, maybe the only country where would decide the other way. And so I think that the conversations that need to happen between Iraqis and Americans are about that. If you really think that we're going to be able to cut all ties to Iran, you are going to have to provide massive compensation. And if you're not going to provide massive compensation, don't expect us to do it. And if you try if you make the relationship about that, you are going to break the relationship.
Thank you very much. Mike, I'll give you the last word.
So I disagree fundamentally with Ken. I'm going to give you a butt, Ken, and it's a big butt, okay? And it's this. I think that I would have a do and a don't for the Iraqi government on US sanctions policy. Do encourage and encourage your own energy sector and work with the US to become self-reliant in gas and gas-powered electricity. Don't buy gas and electricity from Iran when you have more than enough massive world-class amounts of gas being flared right now in your own country, and you're going to buy electricity and gas from Iran instead. So do work with the help that's being offered by the US government right now to use your own resources to power your own power stations. And don't provide Iran with your hard currency, with your precious hard currency. And if you're the Kurds, don't in any way involve the investing of your petrodollars. Why would any country want to allow another country to feed off of their hard currency? So, look towards Iraq's own interests, which is to make their own gas, make their own power, and keep their own valuable hard currency. I think what we're doing is ultimately pushing in a direction that Iraq should and wants to go. Whether the politicians within the country, can be brave enough and strong enough to keep it going in that direction, is a different issue. But I think we're already providing a lot of support on issues like Kirkuk and security force cooperation that give us a good say in the matter.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I could not take all of your questions. I know there were a couple of hands. I'd like to recognize the questions, but we ran out of time. So please join me in saying thanks to a stellar panel here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bilal. Thank you.